Thanks, Jason. Remember, there's a lot more play-by-play videos where those came from. Just search for play-by-play in the Pluralsight library. And now, let's introduce this month's guest. Joining me now is Gavin McShera. Gavin, you have just finished, I guess, your first course for Pluralsight, right? It was Hybrid Cloud in Azure?
Yeah, done. Designing a hybrid cloud in Azure. Yeah, it was an interesting one.
So interesting, why?
You know, it's funny, you're trying to put your thoughts down on paper and talk to someone you know is there, but you're not getting any feedback.
Oh, yeah, the whole talking to your computer thing, yeah.
And people watching and wondering what's happening. So yeah, it is a little strange. But once you get used to the rhythm, it's actually it was very enjoyable. Once I got that final stretch, that final third was actually the best bit.
So the topic interested me a lot when we commissioned that course because, 2, 3, however many years ago, when cloud was going to save the world and cure all disease and everything else, you almost couldn't talk to somebody about cloud without it being moving your entire infrastructure over. And I think Microsoft was kind of one of the first ones to acknowledge really explicitly that that's never going to happen, and you're always going to have some stuff in your own data center, but you might run some stuff in the cloud too. So as you're out there talking to people and working in the environment, do you see companies kind of embracing this whole hybrid idea of running things in different places?
I think they're getting confused by the word hybrid. If I could come up with a better word for hybrid, I'd probably be a rich man. But I think the word hybrid is just it's good procurement. You're just buying the best infrastructure and hosting solution for what you're trying to do. So when you break down that barrier, people are a little bit less hesitant to talk about, okay, hosting one service in Azure, maybe something else on premise, because you're just breaking down those barriers. So it's less about cloud projects and more about actually changing or improving something. So I kind of jokingly said to someone today that every cloud project I've ever been on has failed because they started as cloud projects. It starts off with, look, I worked for Microsoft and I sold Azure. It always ended up in a Amazon versus Azure discussion, which leads you down the path of nowhere. So, dropping the word cloud and actually just talking about, right, what are we going to fix? So what are we trying to solve,
Yeah, and it does bring a little bit to it, though. I mean, companies forever and ever and ever have been fine with hosting, right? We've always had hosting companies for our websites and all that. So I do like the idea of just kind of talking about it that way. But if you start moving a significant number of your assets over to someone else's data center where your physical access to it is a little more restricted, it does create kind of an additional management burden, right?
Completely, and you have to play by somebody else's rules. So the whole backstory on the first course I did in Pluralsight was around spending the time to design and do the due diligence. So you're playing by somebody else's rules. You actually have less choice. It's a software-defined data center, but from a set menu. So you have to kind of pick carefully. You don't just launch straight in there and, well, you can just press new virtual machine and away you go, but they always end in tiers. So there's a little bit more time spent in planning, designing, learning about the service descriptions for that service you're about to embrace, because you have to take on their rules. If Microsoft builds something in a certain way, well, then that's the way you go. If they retire a product, then they retire a product. So you've got to be conscious of playing for someone else's rules.
Does it make it more difficult for people who are used to kind of having everything under their control to split that? Do you find that people struggle having almost two sets of management processes, right? Like the stuff that we have in-house, we're going to use these tools to manage. The stuff that's out of house, we're going to use those tools. And I know that Microsoft is trying to converge that a little bit with things like Azure Stack, but we're really just on the horizon of that, right?
Yeah, we're nowhere near. It is different, and I'm finding a lot of people are struggling because sometimes with the cloud, the due diligence that they may have done for the on-premise systems, even around procurement and standards and so on, goes out the window because they can literally just start throwing in new technology once they move to the cloud. So all of a sudden, you find that you've got more virtual machines, new technology, different versions of SQLs, and the consequence is severe because you pay for every mistake you make, every minute of compute that you request, you're dutifully billed for. So yeah, they are struggling. So I've seen people who are very experienced, 20 years of experience, just assume they know what they're doing, go straight into the cloud, treat the systems exactly the same way they always would on premise, to find that all of a sudden it's not working the way they expected. They weren't getting the performance. The cost was going high. Yeah, it is a struggle.
I think too that folks, rely a little bit too much maybe on their on-prem experience, because we certainly have some bad habits that we never regarded as bad. When I was provisioning SQL servers, I never bought a SQL server with anything less than the maximum number of memory and sockets that it could possibly hold. But that's really overkill in a lot of cases, and you really pay for that on a daily basis if you're doing it in the cloud. Do you find that maybe folks who have a lot of on-prem experience are actually at more of a disadvantage?
Hugely, yeah. They because you've never had that real-time consequence of a decision. So if you're not watching what you're doing, disk space runs away with you. If you're not conscious of the impact of your design decision with SQL, when you move from 4 processors to 8 processors, it doubles the cost significantly. So that benefit of the cloud, being able to turn that dial right up to 10 and 11 and 12, actually has an immediate impact on cost. So again, I kind of referenced it in the course I did in Pluralsight, was that you really have to map out what you believe the projected costs are very, very early on. The consequence of that decision to go with, hey, we'll go with an 8-socket SQL server. That's a huge, huge decision. Maybe you should start way down the stack on the 2-socket box.
And so there's 2 sides to that argument, I think. One is a lot of folks will say, you know what, it's just too hard to figure it out. I'm going to push our company to keep everything on-prem because I understand that. And the other argument is, yeah, but you're actually incurring these huge capital expenses for your company that maybe they're not quite noticing, but you're just a bad designer. And so the cloud is going to force you to be a better designer. Do you kind of have that conversation with people?
It's a difficult one, because you're sometimes telling them that their children are ugly. It's difficult. You're saying you're doing it wrong. You've been doing it wrong for years, but nobody noticed. So yes, it is. It's frustrating people. People are getting quite concerned. They're getting caught out. I see it in my day-to-day job. I help people understand the potential costs of cloud. So a common thing is that people forget about storage. They go on to Amazon or Azure and they say, hey, new VM, there's the compute cost. Hey, that's the figure I'm going to give the CIO, but actually they've forgotten about network, storage, all the things that they never think about when they're on premise, because the network has been there for 10 years and there's a guy who's a Cisco guy in the corner, he looks after it. So it highlights our weaknesses. So that's a challenge for a lot of organizations.
What are some of the more common workloads that you're seeing people kind of take to a hybrid, split type of environment?
I've got a mix of everything from retail systems, to data warehousing. What I'm actually finding is clients of mine that are adopting this are actually using it to think less about infrastructure and more about the data, the MIS layer and the application. So a lot of them are trying to reconfigure their IT functions to have more specialists in line with the business or how they generate revenue, and less about having an army of guys managing a SAN in the corner. So, workloads wise, I've had everything from a lot of Linux boxes for development environment to big SQL always on clusters that are the beginning of a data warehouse. So it's more down to, I think, the timing when you're talking to your business. If there's a system coming end of life, or it's coming to the end of an investment cycle, then maybe people are taking note. So certainly over here in Europe and in Ireland, the companies are starting to spend again. So the timing's actually quite good, and that's why we're seeing that uptake. Is that people are going, yeah, okay, if I'm going to replace this behemoth of an ERP system, where should we host it?
And one thing you said there's kind of interesting too, because I talk to folks a lot about, your IT will be seen less as overhead if you're not focused on commodity services that could be gotten elsewhere. And the big example is always email, right? Why are you spending money managing your own email? Unless you've got a really good reason, it's not a competitive differentiator. It's not going to make you. And so do you see folks kind of taking that as a strategic approach? Let's just have IT do the things that are unique to our special company, and stuff like electricity and storage and DNS we'll let somebody else worry about?
Yeah, certainly the ones I'm working with, that's the way they're thinking, because some of the clients I'm working with, their businesses are moving online. They're moving into new selling channels, new environments. So they're looking at their costs and going, God, I'm going to have to go 24/7 now. I'm going to need a bigger data center. I need 4 more infrastructure guys and a manager for that team. And that was kind of stopping them moving forward. Now they're going, well, actually, I can go out, host this somewhere else, and co-source the support of that maybe to a third-party company. So I don't know what it's like over in the States, but over here, there's a lot of companies who are providing monitoring, management, and support of that commodity infrastructure in Azure. allowing you, I guess, to focus on the data, the application, the analytics, the areas that maybe you will get a competitive advantage. So yeah, I'm seeing IT functions restructure, and those that are not restructuring tend to be the guys sitting on the big old SAN infrastructure and data centers.
So kind of switching to macro cloud economics a little bit, one thing that we're kind of seeing happen with a lot of the services, not so much the specialty services maybe, but certainly your basics like, core running of a VM and basic storage. There's been kind of a price war. Google jumped into this space. There's a lot of small players, and the big gorillas are obviously Amazon and Microsoft, and they're definitely competing on price. What seems to happen in a lot of other industries is almost a race to the bottom on price until the industry can't sustain itself. And then there are some secret backroom illegal collusions where the price suddenly stabilizes. Do you think that's a possibility? Is that something that could happen in the cloud world?
I saw it over here in Europe when the dollar got strong. The price war between Amazon and Microsoft, it was a constant downward trend in the costs. But when dollar got strong, they had to rebalance the euro prices over here. So that was interesting. So all of a sudden, things got a little bit more expensive. So macro economies are going to make a change. We've got a thing over here in Europe where Britain could exit the euro. Who knows what that's going to do to currencies and the cost of cloud. So you're right. It is the race to the bottom. And I kind of explained to someone yesterday that the smallest provider I see in this industry is Rackspace. Imagine calling them the smallest.
Yeah.
I mean, where you hedge your bets.
It
wouldn't be anywhere smaller than Rackspace.
Is it something that companies should do to hedge their bets? I mean, should you have all your eggs in one cloud, or should you definitely be spreading it out a little bit?
I think that the nature of systems is it's going to be spread out automatically. You didn't invest in all your systems at the same time, so they all have different shelf lives for investment cycles. So I think organically that's happening anyway. Should startups put all their eggs in one basket? Yeah, they're going to have to put it in some basket at some point. But the larger organizations, yeah, you need to think about that. So that's why I actually said Rackspace is the smallest. Beyond that, you never know who's going to exit. You're seeing big changes with Dell EMC, HP, OpenStack. I'm betting on the big guys, and Google are coming to the table a lot faster these days with some of the pricing options they have. There's a bit more configuration options there, but yeah, the whole global economy and currencies and everything are going to really change how pricing goes.
I know that one concern CFOs have a lot of times with this pay-as-you-go kind of model is when you buy a bunch of servers and a bunch of racks, then you kind of know what the cost is. If HP or Dell raises their server price later, it doesn't matter. You already bought yours and you can use it for a long time. Yeah. Your electricity and your air conditioning, those are going to be fairly stable pricing. But if I put a bunch of stuff in someone else's data center and I'm paying for compute and network and storage, they can kind of hike the price anytime they want to. And all of a sudden, all my business financial models just got completely whacked. How are people kind of wrapping their heads around that?
I'm kind of cautioning people is if you think the only reason to go to the cloud is to save money, don't do it, because it's not cheaper and it never can be, and you're exposing yourself to that. So you have to be getting something more out of the decision to go to the cloud than just trying to restructure how you spend. If you think about it, okay, let's move from CapEx, and if the business is bad, we can just sit on this hardware, or you go to the whole OpEx model and you have to continue to spend. I think you have to be getting a lot more from cloud to actually justify going there.
And what are some of the things people should be getting out of it other than price?
So I guess it's all down to the industry that you're in. I mean, I was talking to someone today about retail, and they said, hey, what relevance has cloud got in retail? And I kind of said nothing. But the reality is, people in retail are looking at converging selling channels between e-commerce and on-premise. And imagine trying to do that with some physical data centers dotted around the world.
Right. Yeah.
How can you bring all this together? I mean, if you want to do clever omni-channel selling, you need to have a really solid, pretty big infrastructure if you're buying it in terms of network and rack space and so on. Or if cloud fits for you and you've got the pockets to do it, then all of a sudden you've got a global, data center model where you can start to integrate all these systems. So I think that's really what it's all about, is what can you allow an organization to do that they couldn't do in the past that will allow them to be more competitive.
In the past couple of years, we've seen a new Microsoft emerge from the smoldering embers of the old Microsoft, and this new Microsoft is weird to a lot of us who've been in the industry for a while. Suddenly, they not only love Linux, but they want to run Linux containers in the Microsoft cloud, and they not only love Linux, they want to run SQL on Linux. And what's your take on that? I mean, is that changing the conversation for people if they're deciding between providers? Is it kind of making people think differently about Microsoft's path?
I think Microsoft had to do it if they were actually going to be a viable platform. That's the whole point. Is you're looking for a software-defined data center. You wouldn't go to a traditional hoster and they would say, sorry, look, you can't bring that Linux server through our door. We don't like it. So you wouldn't choose them. So I think that's what Microsoft were kind of forced to do. The whole thing on SQL on Linux, I don't know where that's coming from. I thought it was a great move, but it's always going to be a poorer cousin. There's probably going to be a set of functionality difference. But I think it was down to they had to be seen as a platform that you could run the applications and services you want to. Because when you were procuring hosters, think back in the old days. Imagine if a hoster said, sorry, you can't have HP servers in here. We only like Dell. That wouldn't work. So I think they've adopted a clever model. Do they really love Linux? I think they're getting a little bit too much on the other side. I don't care so much now if I can run command shells in Windows 10 anymore. It's more about, hey, look, Red Hat's up there now. And Oracle's up there now. That's great. I actually thought hell would freeze over when I was Red Hat VM, and certainly never thought it when I was actually working for Microsoft. But now Oracle, massive competitors in trying, they've set up their own cloud, and yet you can get Oracle databases on Azure. It's great.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a kind of a strange new world. I tell folks I didn't see a lot of Linux people running around screaming, "Gosh, if only we had SQL Server." So it is a little.
No, yeah, it's nothing.
It's hard to tell where that'll go. When you talk to people who are looking to start servicing some stuff out of the cloud, and they're having to make the decision of Amazon versus Microsoft or maybe Google or Rackspace, what are some of the criteria that you tell them to sit down and think about?
So I always look at the existing investment in their current technology stack. So I used, when we started the call, Don, I mentioned the word procurement, and for me it all starts there. So what purchasing power mechanism relationship can you continue to use to buy clever across the estate? So if you're a traditional Microsoft house across the board, if you buy cleverly, there's some really good cost advantages of going there. When do I end up choosing Amazon over Azure? Sometimes there's just some performance or functionality that you have in Amazon that you don't have in Azure, and that's actually getting less and less frequent now. Most of it is around deterministic performance, reserved minimums and so on. But I generally start with the buying clever. What have you already got? What can we make use of? What relationships have you got? Because a pure Linux house might not be too concerned about the ability for cost savings of Windows Server licenses in a hybrid cloud. They probably won't care about that. So it's different in every client.
What are some kind of last thoughts as we come near the end of our time here? Something that you would want to leave with somebody if maybe they're working for an organization that has a few VMs running in the cloud. Maybe they've got a few websites running up there that are publicly accessible. But if somebody was really looking to make sure that their career was lined up for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, what would you tell them to kind of have in mind?
So I think the first thing to do is read the manual. The cloud, whatever cloud platform you're going to go with, know the service descriptions, know what you're dealing with, know the rules. I think the second thing then is, if you're going to do something meaningful or impactful in your business, don't just run a couple of VMs in the cloud, find a problem. A really problem that the business will clearly acknowledge and fix it. Now, if it just so happens that cloud was part of it, you fixed a problem with cloud. But from a career perspective, if you're an infrastructure person, move away from managing kind of blinking lights and solve problems. That's kind of the trick.
I think that's the best advice we could offer. Thanks very much for your time. It was great talking to you, and I look forward to your next course.
Great, Don. Have a good day. Cheers. 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 Cheers.